This
the presentation.
conference will now be recorded.
So, John, do you want to share the slide pack?
Yeah, just give me 1 second to get it up.
Okay.
Up here. I restart. I had to restart. Okay. There we go. All right. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. All right. I'm gonna get my stuff together here. John, do you want to start?
Yes, I'll go ahead and start. So, I think several of the the topics that we have listed here, we've been talking about for the last couple of months. We have started getting some little bit of momentum on reference designs. We've had a couple folks talking to Don, John, and I offline. We've got some that are coming in here in the near term, so that's positive. I think one of the other things that we have talked about in recent times about the BIM content, and because that's tied into this show me your megawatt topic here. But the BIM content, what is it we're looking for in terms of families from the vendor community? One of the projects I'm working on right now, we're actually going to be working with a Revit consultant that supports our business to develop an appropriate Revit family for one of the immersion vendors that's basically meets all the criteria that we're looking for within the OCP community. We're developing that specifically for a project, and when we get that family completed, which should be here in the next couple of weeks, I intend on sharing that with the group so that folks can take a look at it and get a better feeling for the level of information we're looking for, the level of graphical detail we're looking for, and also a direct bit of data on what it actually took to create that BIM content using a consultant, including what the costs were for us to do that. So we'll be sharing that information here, like I said, within the next couple of weeks. I think one of the things that to me, it's a hot topic in this conversation that we're going into on the second round. We talked a little bit about differential pressure, differential temperature 2 weeks ago, and I kind of want to circle back around onto the conversation of form factor and what is associated with form factor. And when you look at these example layouts here on the screen, we've got an immersion solution and we have an RDHX solution shown. We also, you could also say the one on the left is, it's listed as a cold plate there. So one of the things that you see when you look at that is each one of those solutions has a different IT density per square foot, has different equipment in the space, and so on and so forth. And the geometry of the actual enclosures and how they fit into the room is, part of the form factor discussion. We've also talked about row pitch in the discussion. The other piece of this that I want to bring back up is floor loading design. And one of the challenges that I think we run into is that we tend to think, that being most of the folks in the call, tend to think of floor loading in terms of the loading that the footprint of the ITE itself, the actual enclosure, places on the floor. I think 2 weeks ago there were conversations about 350 pounds a square foot, 400 pounds a square foot, somewhere in that range, and that we need to design for something a little bit higher than that to allow for increased density within the enclosures. The problem is when you go and you talk to a structural engineer or you talk to an architect about floor loading, they're looking at the average floor loading for the entire space, and they are looking at point loads. But all the dead space around the equipment factors into that calculation. So, you know, your maintenance access clearances, your aisle widths in front of and behind the equipment, all of that actually factors into the floor loading. So, you know, when we say a piece of equipment may be 400 pounds a square foot, within the footprint of that unit, it may be 400 pounds a square foot. But when we start talking about what the actual floor has to be designed for to account for that, that number is much lower because you get to leverage the square footage of the aisles in front of and behind. The reason I wanted to kind of bring that back up into the conversation is because if we lose sight of that when we're talking about facility floor design, one, we're going to end up with manufacturing floors for our floor structures. They're going to be seriously overbuilt. And we're basically going to sit here and tell folks that you can never put an immersion solution on the second floor of the building because nobody's ever going to design the second floor slab for 500 pounds a square foot. So, you know, I think it is very important that we bring that conversation to the forefront. And, you know, and start working on what these different form factors are that we have today from different manufacturers and what the clearances are around them so that we can understand where folks actually are today. Any thoughts or comments on
that? John, from a space perspective, space planning perspective, what factors aside from floor loading, and you know, floor loading has a couple aspects. Obviously, there's static floor loading and there's rolling floor loading, which is something that needs to be addressed as well. But what other aspect ratio items are we concerned with OCP? And are you seeing, is it the widths, the depths, the heights, and other side clearances, for example? What are the factors that you think are the most important at this point?
You know, from what I'm seeing in the work we're doing, the design work we're doing, is the front to back depth, and the access clearances and the height. And when I talk about the height, I think it's important to remember that we're talking about the full height of not just the enclosure, but the maintenance access as well. This is particularly important when we talk about vertically loaded immersion. So it's the height of the tank plus the overhead clearance required to pull a server out of the tank with whatever rigging is required to get the server pulled up out of the tank. Any kind of drip pans that are required underneath or service racks that are required under, you know, for that process. What is the actual maximum height that's required? And my thinking behind that is it's common practice and has been common practice for a while for us to run structured cabling infrastructure, if nothing else, over the top of the racks you know, when we deal with conventional racks. And if we say that our you know, we can do, say, 2.5 meters of overhead clearance, and you have an immersion solution, for example, that needs 2.6 meters of overhead clearance, and there's cable tray over the top, it simply doesn't work. So, you know, we need to understand what those requirements are from the community today. And again, you know, I think the focus for this first round of form factor discussions is understanding where the community is today, so we can see, do we have convergence on certain criteria that we say we want to lock down to maintain that convergence going forward? And do we have other dimensions where there's not a lot of convergence and we need to have a lot of discussion on how we handle those particular dimensions?
Excellent. You know, to put a bit of a view onto what John was just mentioning, this is a liquid cooled rack solution here. You can see the supply and return piping is running in front, or basically looks level of most, or just a little bit above the top of those racks. Now, depending on and I'm not familiar with this installation. Maybe Don can shed some light, but you wouldn't be able to, it looks like you wouldn't be able to easily get on the top of these racks from here. So to John's point, if your cabling is running in a cable tray running along the tops of the racks here, something like this in the front might be a problem, right? If I go to this other solution here, which is in a modular container, the pipes are running underneath the floor, I believe, but again, cabling, same thing, overhead could be a problem. It's also true here. So the top of things, especially for immersion, are important. So you can see here, if you need to get to the top surfaces of these items, got a lot of piping in your way. So you may be able to still do it, but certainly a consideration.
Right, and the other part of it is, that one of our driving goals is to try to make the facility as modular as possible to accept multiple ACS solutions. And so if we design around, say, a vertical rack, right, whether it's an RDHX or whether it's a cold plate or horizontally loaded immersion, and that's a 2.5 meter tall rack, for example, and somebody comes in after the fact and wants to change out to an immersion tank, again, that needs, say, 2.6 meters total. If there's infrastructure that was put in overhead based on a 2.5 meter high rack, and you bring in an immersion tank that needs 2.6 meters, then it doesn't work, which means we haven't achieved the modularity that we're looking for on the facility side. And so understanding what those boundary conditions are is going to be a key thing. So what my intention was to basically put together a very basic spreadsheet, and this is kind of from a questionnaire perspective, not a presentation perspective, but basically put together a spreadsheet of some of the key dimensional criteria that we're looking for, and send that out to the sub-project leads for the various ACS sub-projects, send it out to their project leads, and ask them to share it within the community, and provide that information back so we can kind of aggregate it and see, again, the first run is to see where everybody is today. And that will help us better focus the conversation going forward on what we need to address. And then from there, we can start diving off into things like, okay, what are the actual real live floor loadings that we're seeing and whatnot. And I know floor loading is going to be a difficult thing for a lot of the ACS manufacturers to comment on, because the IT provisioning inside that IT enclosure, that ACS solution, is going to vary from customer to customer. And so I think the part of the conversation has got to be a realization that the IT loading is not consistent today, and it's not going to stay flat. It's going to probably trend to a higher pounds per square foot going forward as IT densities increase. So, recognizing that there's that gap there, and we've got to figure out a way to address it, we'd like to collect whatever information we can.
Excellent. John, are you thinking putting out what you mentioned to the sub leads? Should they then forward this survey? Are we going to do this via something like SurveyMonkey, or what do you foresee, and what can the people on the call expect to see in their inboxes? Will it be a link to a survey, or should we just be gaining that feedback on these individual calls?
So I don't want to spend the time doing it on the individual calls. I'd like to coordinate with you and Don and the ACS sub project leads, maybe offline, on exactly how we're going to transmit the survey out to folks. Yeah, I think it's something we definitely need to get our heads wrapped around here shortly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hi, John. This is Suresh Pichai, Equinix. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in the interim is probably best to say, please consult your structural engineer for slab design, anchoring, and earthquake related tie downs, etc. Because that covers all of it. Because it's quite difficult to give very generic guidelines for how do we go about doing this.
It is, Suresh, that's a good point. But that said, do you think there's value here, I think, in establishing upper limits for what would be considered OCP ready versus do what you'd like, right? For example, you could design to a 600 pound per square foot, concrete floor, but you probably won't unless you're told to. So
Yeah.
do you have a guidance there?
You are trying to put a guidance on something that we don't that nobody really knows 100%, and that's, in my opinion, I think what Suresh is proposing is the right thing, because you really have to leave it at the moment until it catches on to the people that are building this stuff. You cannot come up, in my opinion, with a requirement for something which is not well understood yet.
Yeah.
Well, and to be clear, what we're trying to do is we're trying to gather data, which for the most part right now has been kind of kept within the notebooks of the ACS vendors, and we're trying to socialize that information so that we can put together informed guidance. Obviously, for today, anybody that's designing a facility today for this, you're going to have to consult the structural engineer. But if you're starting from scratch and you're doing a greenfield construction project, you've got to have a basis of design for your structural slab. And so right now,
Yeah.
the goal is to understand where folks are so that we can help folks put together a reasonable basis of design today while we're developing the guidance.
Yeah, I can tell you what I tell my company, right? But I don't want to share anything in terms of calculations and the reasoning behind and take the liability. I would say typically on the first level when you're slab on grade or something where it's a lot less expensive to do that, target 500 pounds per square foot, no problem. If you want to do it above the first level of the ground level, have locations, either in the central spline or where it is most cost effective to provide areas where immersion based liquid cooling can be accommodated. In other words, don't try to do it across the board because it gets pretty expensive. So if you want to have a mix of cabinet type and tank type, try to keep the tank type to the level where the slab's easier to build at the higher capacity, and then the rest of the floors have designated areas where you have the ability to access the freight elevator and then immediate vicinity perhaps.
Well, so Suresh, I agree with that. I mean, the prudent thing to do is to identify zones within the structure, right?
Yep.
But the question becomes, if I'm trying to design for multiple technologies in an OCP type environment, what is the actual real floor loading that we expect to see from this stuff? So for example, I'm working right now with some single phase immersion stuff, and when you look at the weight, the floor loading for the footprint of the actual immersion solution, the wet weight with ITE in it, et cetera, is around 325 to 340 pounds a square foot. However, when you look at it from a structural perspective and you take into account the clearances around that equipment, the aisle widths and so on and so forth, we're down around 150 pounds a square foot. So if part of this conversation is every one of these solutions has a different footprint, has a different wet weight, has different clearance requirements. And so what is the range of actual floor loadings that we see from these solutions today? Because if we go in and we just tell them 500 pounds a square foot, I guarantee you every place that's getting built to 500 pounds a square foot is being severely overbuilt.
Yeah, that's my point. See, the thing is, then I'll ask you questions. Okay, how thick is your uh, plate that you put on the floor to spread the load? What is the thickness of the steel plate? And well, then of course you have to start detailing how you're going to get there's a level difference, right? So you have to design a detail for it, um, because it's not a simple question of the load automatically distributes itself over the entire area. You need to facilitate that. There is design involved in it, right? And then also you have the seismic considerations in locations like California.
Yep.
And then there are other things that are newly coming up in the market which we haven't tested out. There are ways to mitigate the vibration transmission, etc. So there's a lot of details involved where simple guidelines that you can summarize are very hard. And the best thing you can do is like I pointed out, that you have specific zones you design for it, and then you certainly have to look at how do you spread the load. And the other thing is, your number 325 might be very good for a single phase. In fact, the fluid is lighter, and you don't have the pressure problem where you have to contain it. You don't have a GWP problem. But if you're going to have a two-phase immersion solution, you of necessity have a much sturdier tank because you have to contain it and you have to leak proof it, and then you're going to find that the numbers readily exceeded for as compared to single phase. So yeah, you can provide very detailed guidelines, but then it becomes all of a sudden of almost halfway engineering there.
I think that at this point of immersion, it is a niche play. And with a niche play, you're playing with fire when you're trying to get with that kind of level of detail. Once, assuming that immersion catches on, which we don't know yet, then it's a different story. But at this point, you could make some comments about it, but I do not believe that you could come up with a comprehensive requirement document on spec, because you're going to
discussion.
You're going to confuse.
The answer to all, yeah. So Shlomo, real quick, the answer to a lot of this is the continued promotion of vendor input into the show me your megawatt as well as to the individual sub projects. And what's happening? We are getting vendors, Submer and GRC and others are starting to submit drawings and data on what a megawatt worth of their product would be, as well as the weight factors associated with their product. As those examples come in, we can answer these specific questions for the vendors that are participating. And in typical OCP fashion, eventually this will boil down into a more globalized standard. But once you see a megawatt, and that's why we're promoting the concept to show us your megawatt, because that will show a megawatt worth of GRC or Spiritus or Submer will reveal something of the range that would be needed for flow loading to support that. So that's just kind of highlighting the urgency and getting that data so that we can add this. But in the meantime, it's a very valid discussion, and we should keep going forward on these things we've got.
But you're still having, in a way, and I don't want to sound too negative, in a sense, you're still having the blind leading the blind here. And that's, in my opinion, a very big risk. Suresh, because he's in a specific situation, they are studying, and I'm sure they're doing analysis and studying what they have to do. And they're not going to share with everybody because it may be unique to them. So
right, but Suresh is not an ACS manufacturer.
No, I understand.
We're asking the ACS manufacturers to let us know where they are today. That's all we're asking right now.
Well, as I said, you can get the info, but publishing it, in my opinion, could be more confusing than adding value.
Well, we're not going to know whether that's true or not until we've actually got information to look at. Well, so step number one is to survey the information and see what we've got. And quite frankly, if the answer that comes back is that we've got a scatter plot of information all over the place, and we've got floor loadings that are all over the place, and there's no convergence of it for any reason, that in and of itself is valuable information that we need to come back and huddle up with the ACS. team
No,
for
I
power.
agree with you. Let me not, be confused that I'm all for gathering all the information that's available that people are willing to share and put it out because we all learn together. I'm absolutely
Mm.
not against the survey, absolutely not against the call. And I'm also with Shlomo because you before you make a guideline, you have to have fully understood the problem. And so, yeah, certainly support both views.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's the intent, and that's the intent here, right? So take somebody like Suresh, you've got quite a lot of floor space, Suresh, and a lot of experience with this and design parameters. You can assess that. It's not every customer is going to have that ability. There are going to be companies that are going out, for example, to corporate real estate finders, and one of their chief parameters is going to be floor loading on the first and second floors of these when they're identifying existing buildings they can use. So I think there needs to be some guidance. It doesn't have to be a yes, no type of a thing, but some guidance. And we might even have tiers of guidance, right? If you think about it, depending on what kind of solutions you want to put in. For example, you could have up to this level or up to this level. The other thing I wanted to just bring up real quick here is the idea of, we can give a recommendation, and our recommendation is almost certainly going to be a very simplified version, which is this floor loading capacity per square foot or per unit area for a given, both on the, maybe on the base floor, on the different floors of a building. But in reality, if you are being smart about it, let's say that this deck right here, which is on the second floor of this building, is designed for 250 pounds per square foot. That is across the entirety of that. You can put something on average that's going to weigh that, right? But if you're a little smarter about it, you know that you can put a lot more heavy things right near the columns or right at a girder. And, so that is engineering. That's what, the Shlomo said, the blind leading the blind. That's not the blind leading the blind. It's you're going to have your structure engineers look at this. What we're trying to do is effectively dumb it down so that we have a background of data based on actual equipment and actual experience today, so that OCP users can purchase and build their buildings with a little bit of guidance from us.
Yeah, and along those lines, the first step of this, once we collect the data, very well may be just simply publishing, in the first round of the paper, a chart that shows a typical RDHX deployment today has an average floor loading of X number of pounds a square foot, and an average cold plate has an average floor loading, and maybe it's a range, right? But it's something to at least give building owners, give design engineers a place to start. It's not trying to engineer it for them. It's trying to give them a place to start to get an idea of what they're going to be looking at. And then as we evaluate the data, we can figure out if there's more opportunity to refine from there.
Yeah, could you please go back to the diagram that you showed with the columns and the footings, right?
Yes, can do, Suresh. There you go. Sorry, I just quickly Googled so I could
Yeah,
get some
no,
columns.
okay. So the way, think about this, that if you have point loads, the point loads need to be addressed. See, when you say design for a floor loading of, say, X pounds per square foot,
Mhm,
you basically have covered everything. You covered what is the
mhm.
thickness, the reinforcement of the concrete slab. You've looked at the beams, the girders. You also looked at the columns, and you also look at the punch through strength of the column at the footing, and whatever else you do in terms of grade beams. So all of that is completely covered when you give a single number guidance, because
Yes.
unless all of that is satisfied, you can't say that it's 500 or 400 or 250. But if you provide something else, for example, between these four columns, the overall average floor loading is going to be not exceeding, say, 250. The level of information you provided is a little bit less, because then they still have to worry about the point load nature of things on the in between girders or beams and the actual thickness of the slab, etc. And then you have, you basically, when you say structural design satisfying this floor loading, which is a complete set of requirements for the entire structure assembly. So you have to be careful, right? So if you're going to start, if you start optimizing and trying to reduce the guidance you provide, you also have to indicate what are the things that the engineer needs to take into account.
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, on that point, Suresh, I wasn't implying that, I would say, hey, you can put your heavy items, don't put them here, put them here. That is, in fact, the case, but we would never do anything like that in this kind of a forum, right? You're 100% right on the money as far as a single value is the key item that we're looking for, right?
And I think to kind of further that, and Suresh, I think it probably aligns, I think, fairly well with what you're saying, is ultimately what we're trying to do is say that the average load applied by a piece of ITE, including its horizontal clearances, is X number of pounds per square foot. And from there, you need to understand, the engineer needs to understand that as the IT layout is configured, as and as the room is laid out and the space is laid out, how that impacts point loads, how that impacts what the actual average floor load is, that all changes, right? That number changes, but it's a starting point to say that, if you look at the physical footprint of this piece of equipment plus its clearances, this is the loading over that area.
Yeah, I think it's a worthwhile exercise to get the data from the manufacturers and then walk it through. Yeah.
And guys, sorry for joining late. Busy as always, but I want to just put that out there. I come from the manufacturer side of things and offerings to the public. I think that a lot of the stuff that we're doing in OCP, not just in this particular one, but as a collective, there is so much information that actually does benefit this type of thing going forward. And while we don't have every single answer that's going to be in this particular document, if you have references in this document that goes to another document, which is what we did in immersion standards and immersion compatibility, then we have an actual living document that actually does give a really nice pathway for a starting point. And anybody who deploys without actually doing their own research and their own level of expertise in what they're going to deploy, then that's on them. But this is an actual, I've been doing this now with OCP for a little while. I think this is a fantastic path, and I'm really happy to be part of it myself.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. I appreciate that input. So, right now the preliminary spreadsheet that I've put together is basically looking at width, depth, and height, what the actual equipment footprint is in those three dimensions, and what the clearances are on each side of that. So, with the width, you've got your left side clearance, right side clearance, because it's not going to be the same necessarily for every solution. Depth, front, you've got the rear clearance, front clearance. Height, you've got any overhead clearance and any, underfloor clearance, right? For folks that are connecting in from the bottom. And then I've got an empty weight and a typical wet weight. And that was kind of what I was thinking we would start with, and send that out to Rick and over there at TMG, send it out to Submer, send it out to Childine, to Shlomo, and all the various manufacturers on here, and just get some of those basic parameters filled in. And then once we get that data in and we can start merging it and analyzing it, we can get an idea of the spread of where we are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will confirm for you guys, TMG is on board with this. We will be submitting for both two-phase and single-phase offerings for what we're going to be able to do and help us along the way.
Great.
Thanks, really appreciate that.
John, I wasn't able to quickly locate that spreadsheet. Do you want to share your screen? If you, I don't know if you have that in a form that you'd want to share it yet. John? Hello?
I think we lost John.
Wasn't sure if I lost the whole meeting. Yeah, sorry, Rip. But it's a good discussion, and I think Shlomo's point is well taken too, which is we don't want to hamstring things or limit anything by putting a unnecessary number down, but we do want to try to provide some guidance so that
John,
people will be able to source real estate and design properly for what is the bulk of what's on the market. And that document can change over time, as John Gross started mentioning. The gent from Rich from TMG Core mentioned that can evolve over time. And it may well be that we have different numbers for immersion tanks versus other types of equipment, but it is the kind of feedback, the kind of information that is quick to find and that would provide a planner the ability to go and look at what they're going to build, really, at the end of the day. Any thoughts on that?
Hey, John, can you hear me?
Herb, looks like Herb was just going to say something. Yeah, I can hear you now, John.
Yeah, sorry, my headset decided to tell me that I needed to charge it right when it turned itself off.
I gotta love it. Yeah, so we were just mentioning that I think it's I am also like Shlomo in the boat where I don't want to over constrain things, but I would like to provide some guidance here, like with the other parts of OCP where we have OCP guidance and OCP ready. We want to provide something that is valuable information to the community that's going to look at these documents and read these documents and be on these calls. So, John, we have a time frame when we figure we'll get that survey information out.
Yeah, I'll email you my chicken scratch here after the call, and you can take a look at it and tell me what you think, and we can figure out with Don how we want to get this disseminated to the group.
Okay. Yeah, so it's probably reasonable to say we'll have it out within a week or so to this group. And so if you see something from maybe a survey type of well, it could be also an OCP email, but it's a survey monkey type of an email from OCP. That's also a possibility.
Hey, John M. and John G. This is John Vasili. I think it's a good conversation, and I think you are going to publish, and I like John's concept, it's going to be a scattergram, and of course you're going to see a concentration of loads within that gram. But that scattergram, I think the end of this is going to be a slide or some presentation that shows a range of 150 to 300 or 500, whatever it's going to be, and then the user of that information could say, okay, I'm going to land in the center of that. I was just doing some calculation in the background, listening to you guys, and I know the minimum floor, no pun intended, the minimum flooring is going to be 150 pounds per square foot, even given all the spaces and all the utility areas. So, that would be the start point of any discussion. So if you're going to go buy a building or start a building, I'm going to tell your engineer, you're looking for something at least 150 pounds per square foot for just standard installations. If you have things that are more exotic or future looking, you're looking for a 10 or 20 year design, then you're probably going to bump into the 300 pound or whatever it's going to be. But I think this would be good information. I think it's going to end up as a scattergram, and then the user of that information could choose where they want to be on that graph. But I think it's going to set a floor. It's going to set a bottom end of the scale is going to be somewhere around 150 to 200 pounds, so you don't make any serious mistakes.
Oh, thank you. So let's see, John Gross has lost his headset. I had to reboot right as the meeting was started, and we are losing Don. He's running out of battery on his on his laptop at the show. So Don, if we lose you, take care. That's exactly right, John Vasili. I think establishing a minimum, and then like John Gross said, maybe a scatter plot is the way to go. Any feedback on that? By the way, this is all talk of obviously floor loading or pressure on the floor. Are there any other comments that people would like to add right now as far as other dimensions, right? So the height, width, depth, any considerations or kind of things you might feel are important for this discussion? One of the obvious ones is the pitch of a rack, right? So the pitch from then, when I say pitch, I mean lateral pitch. So looking at a rack from the front, and then what's the next OCP rack over? What's the distance there? That will be part of our discussion on form factor. But again, height and depth are also in there as well. Any comments?
So John and John, part of this, John Michele again. So I use a lot of busway in my designs and 1200 amp bus. They're pretty stout fixtures, and then the bus taps themselves are in the 40-50 pound range each, depending on how long the cords are, using bigger taps and double taps. Anyway, the design may need to include things outside the manufacturer's supplies, right? If you're a rear door heat exchanger, you may not account for the busway weights and the cable tray weights and things like that. And, you know, for example, uninsulated twisted pair is, I just happen to know this, is 11 pounds per 1,000 foot. So you could do the calculation. You have 500 wires running down your path, what that weight's going to be. Where would we drag that into this conversation?
Ooh, I don't think we have yet, but that's a very interesting and good point. And as you say that, the other thing that comes to mind is while the busway weights should be taken into consideration, you should also be considering where they're going to be weighted off of, right?
Right.
And I say that because they very well could be hung from
You're surcharging the floor above, right, or the roof.
Yeah, they're a floor charge on the floor above because they're hanging versus being supported from the floor, or they're supported from the floor, in which case that you have to account for that as well. So that's a very good point, actually.
So I think the one thing that that we need to keep in mind, though, is we need to understand kind of the line of demarcation where the ACS vendors can provide input to this conversation, and where it's not necessarily reasonable that they can. I think what you're talking about, John Michele, I think is going to be highly dependent on whether or not the ACS vendor is providing some of that other infrastructure, right? So if you're talking about like structured cabling infrastructure, and I think about, for example, an HPC cluster. Typically, when you buy an HPC cluster, you're getting multiple cabinets, you're getting the network pathways, the cable tray, et cetera, and the structured cabling is usually part of that whole turnkey solution. I think that's a different scenario than, say, somebody going to Childyne, for example, and buying, 10 cold plate racks full of IT gear. The structured cabling for that is probably not going to be within Childyne's scope of supply, and therefore they wouldn't have any control over it. And so I think it's something that we need to maybe identify as a parameter or an input that is not included in the loading data that's provided, but needs to be considered by the
exactly what I suggest. To your point, the rear door heat exchanger manufacturer doesn't necessarily have to have that other infrastructure in their design. So that we have to put an asterisk in there somewhere and say, this is what else you need to account for, or how we want to manage that. I agree. That's kind of how I would handle it also, that you take where you can identify all the parameters and the weights, you put those in there, but then you have to put this asterisk that says, because I'll give you an example on the elevations that get missed all the time. Back to busway, it's my most familiar design, is the turning radius or the bending radius of the cable. So when you're using a number 4 cable, like a 60 amp cable or 80 amp cable, it's an inch and between an inch 0.1 and an inch 0.5 diameter. So it's got a bend between your point of leaving the bus and coming into your cabinet. So that elevation alone burns you between 7 and 9 inches alone. So there's there's some other elevation considerations that we'll have to put asterisks around.
For sure.
Thank you. That's good. Okay. Further on that topic, anybody have anything to add or consideration? Actually, I think it's probably, since we've got about 10 minutes left here, what John Musili just brought up, kind of call them ancillary items that are going to influence clearances and floor or loading. If we can think of any others that might be important, that's good to have. We've got busway down here. You've also got structured cabling.
You saw the comment on the chat from Otto, right?
Cosmo, I didn't catch that.
Oh, there's a comment in the chat from Otto that says, this is a great discussion. When we send out the survey, we should consider asking for other typical design requirements, such as typical ash rate, W cooling level, and typical percentage of capture to liquid. And
Sorry.
Just to add to the survey, if we send out a survey, I guess it's going to be like a drop-down menu of the decided say answers. I would leave at least one section where people can put comments. This is very valuable feedback
Absolutely.
for all of us, right?
Absolutely, and I think John and I, when we put this together, will certainly allow for other as a answer or a category.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you.
In
and
Otto's,
and I guess so Otto, on the W class and the percent capture to liquid, I guess my only question would be, so that's gets into the thermal side of the solution design, as opposed to the physical, the dimensional and the weight attributes to it. We could definitely ask the question. I don't know how much impact that information is going to have on that, as opposed to say a rear door versus a cold plate versus, and one thing that we need to include in this conversation, John Minash, is going to be the hybrid solutions, right? Because there's a number of solutions that are out there that are a combination of cold plate and rear door, specifically to address what Otto mentions in here, which is the typical percent capture to liquid. So I think, the overall infrastructure of the solution will tell us quite a bit. I don't have an issue asking those questions. I'll be interested to see if there's any correlation between W class and percent capture to liquid and those other parameters.
Yeah, and my only comment first, thanks, is as long as we're sending out a survey, let's address everything that goes along with cooling solutions. And all the structural and clearance and all that we're talking about is certainly very important, but as long as you're asking the question of all the vendors, a lot of who are on this call, if they can give some kind of broad guidelines that we can repeat, and it's probably, like you said, broken into categories of cold plate and immersion and rear door or combinations of those. I think that'd be useful design guidelines for OCP to provide. And again, it's going to be a range, it's not going to be this exact number, but that would help me as an owner when I'm considering different design solutions. That's my comment.
Yeah, I would support that. I think you have to be comprehensive, because you don't want to bombard people with multiple surveys. And after all, this is I thought this was a heat recovery focused meeting. So we're already covering all aspects of it. So if you're going to go to manufacturers and ask for information, ask the thermal, the structural, the architectural, and the network, anything that you can categorize on the real key parameters included in this survey, then it can be very useful.
Yeah, and I think the point's well taken about not getting too many surveys. The flip side of that is, though, that John and I would like to get something out in the short term that is actually effective to provide some feedback here. So we'll do our best there, I think.
So let me ask this, and I agree with the idea of trying to keep the number of surveys to a minimum. Does it make sense to have one survey that is kind of the structural architectural side of it, and then one side that is the thermal side of it, and keep those as two separate surveys? Does anybody have an issue with that?
I'd say we could do that, but they are entangled. So you can't really think of one without the other.
Okay. Well, we could probably take that one offline and think about it a little bit when we put it together. And as mentioned earlier, we'll put some free form, add your comments areas here so that those kinds of items, if we see some correlation between, for example, supply water temperature and floor loading, or different types of technologies, we can put them in there. But we would like to get something quickly, and that is grabbing a large percentage of the market that's at least participating in these calls, so we can get a good idea of those values.
I would like to offer up from whatever I can do. I got some experiences doing, before coming to TMG, even before that, 5 or 6 different, 6 actually locations where there's 100,000 plus square feet where we're taking heat reuse. And we're also looking at all this as well now as well. And so if there are questions or that you would like to maybe pass to me directly in an email, feel free, and I can try answer what I can answer, and for whatever that's worth.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that offer. And by the way, and Suresh also mentioned that he thought this might be a heat reuse. So if, I don't think we've made it entirely clear how we're breaking this out, but what was always the ACF call is now going to be roughly every 2 weeks. So every other week we'll be doing heat recovery, which Cosmo Piccioli and Jaime Camella will be running, and then John and I will be running what was effectively the ACF portion of the call, the connections and other guidance like that related to liquid cooling. So Cosmo, do you want to comment on what the next heat recovery call is and what the topic is?
Yeah, so next Tuesday, we actually have a presentation from a company, again, unfortunately out of Europe, that does local heat, like district heating. And what we try to do is to have like a presentation and then 2 consecutive meetings to gather information and work on a document that kind of does the same thing. It's a guidance of very broad information if you want to implement a heat recovery solution where you are, what options you have. But you have district heating, you have desalination, you have biomass drying, all these kind of options based on the geography, the temperature that you have, and the quantity. So we are working on that, and so alternatively, we will have presentations by companies that they do this kind of activities, and then we will have discussions on how to implement that more in the US.
Great. John Gross, anything you want to add before we start closing this up?
No, I think I'm good.
All right. Anyone else? And if not, we will close the meeting, start recording here in a moment.
Who would I send the show us your megawatt concept to?
You can send it to myself, John Minash at Vertiv, or john.minash at ocproject.org.
Maybe if you put your email address in the chat.
Yeah, can do. Okay.
All right.
We're gonna shut the recording off, and if anybody has anything they'd like to add off the record, we can